Next is Ann Cooper, now a very popular professor, I've heard from her students at Columbia Journalism School, but known to many of you as a great foreign correspondent for NPR in Moscow and in South Africa. Ann's Moscow years were 87 to 92, which I consider the most exciting years since John Reed was reporting from Petrograd, and I envy her that experience. Carry on.
Yeah, thank you, Bob. First, I want to say my colleague Ann Garrell sends her greetings. She worked with many of you in many different eras in and out of Russia, and she really had hoped to be here today, but wasn't able to at the last minute. She has a book coming out next month called Putin Country, A Journey into the Real Russia, and it's based on her couple of decades or so of reporting from Chelyabinsk, a location that she chose to get out of Moscow and see what was happening in Russia in the years after 1991. And I'm hoping that we can bring her back up here to Columbia sometime this spring to talk about that book. So just to be absolutely precise, I arrived in December of 1986 and left at the end of September of 1991 in what was then very much the Soviet Union. And I refer to them as the good years. And yeah, I'm really happy that I was there for that era. And it was an accident of timing to be there, to start at that time and to leave at that time, but it turned out to be, amazing set of boundaries, time boundaries. First of all, when I arrived, it was still very much the gray and grim Soviet Union. We all lived in foreigners' compounds still. There was a milliman who kept people out or, scrutinized everybody who was coming in, or cars had those day-glow yellow license plates with K004, so we were instantly recognizable as not just foreigners, but American correspondents. We all assumed our phones were bugged. We had to register our trips with the foreign ministry, and they would deny you permission to go, and that continued for quite a bit of the time that I was there if it was something sensitive. After the pogrom against Armenians in Sumgait, 6 months, nobody could get there. When the Narodny Front was first forming in Yerevan, couldn't get there. And even after, I'm sure this was after Lithuania had declared its independence, there was a period when Russia was, or the Soviet Union still, was cutting off gas and, trying to punish them for this action, and we were not allowed to travel there. So I saw, a lot of the restrictions and the kind of atmosphere that you guys worked in, before. But I also, almost immediately when I arrived, things began to change. Andrei Sakharov was out of exile in Gorky. Within weeks, the Perm political camps were being emptied. And Bob, you reminded me of my favorite Elena Bonner story. So I worked for AP for a while when I first got there, and you guys trusted me on a Saturday for the first time to go in alone, because I finally knew how to work the telex machine. It happened to be the day that everybody had been let out of Perm, and there are telexes from New York saying, we're hearing that so-and-so and so-and-so and so-and-so have been let out of Perm camp number whatever. And I had 2 or 3 messages from New York, and I realized, okay, how do I confirm this story? I call Sakharov's apartment. Please let Sakharov answer the phone. And of course, Elena answered the phone. And she was, very abrupt with me. Yes, we're hearing this too. We've heard from some people who've gotten out, but she really wanted to get rid of me. And I managed to ask her, why is this happening? Do you know why this is happening? And she said, it's an ukaz of the Supreme Soviet. And my Russian, I was barely hanging on by my fingernails at that point. I'm all alone in the office. There's no translator. And I'm thinking, she's just told me why, and I don't really understand because I never learned this word, ukaz. So I asked her the same question 3 times so I could make sure I'd heard the word right, and I could look it up after and see, a decree of the Supreme Soviet. And then she said, I have to go, the phone has to be, free for more people to call in, because they're calling in all the time. And everybody from AP was out playing broom ball, by the way. I don't know if anybody still does that. The political prisoners are out, and all of a sudden there's a new population of people that we can talk to, and not only can we talk to them, they want to talk to us. Lev Timofeyev, Sergei Grigoryants, some of the dissidents who had been in prison and were released into Moscow, they would have press conferences in Grigoryants's apartment. But, we could go and hear their latest complaints, and they could complain, very vocally without fear of consequences anymore. So this is all like very early 1987, and would have been really astonishing for you guys if you had been there. It was pretty astonishing for me, even without a lot of history. Everyone who reported there in that era, I'm sure, has their own sort of defining moments. And I'm just going to tell you quickly about a couple of other defining moments for me in 1987. There was a Jewish refusnik named Fyodor Finkel, and in early 87, refusniks some of them were starting to get permission finally to leave after things had been shut down in 1979. Fyodor Finkel wasn't getting his permission. He went on a hunger strike. We're all writing about it. One day I'm at home in Sad Sam. Phone rings. I pick up the phone, and it's another Jewish refusnik telling me Fyodor Finkel got his permission. I go, okay, great. Hang up the phone. A little while later, phone rings again. Pick it up, another refusnik telling me the same thing. I think I had 3 or 4 different calls that day telling me that. And it took me a while to realize, oh my God, they've never called me at home before, because of course everyone assumed our phones were bugged, and I was never supposed to call a Jewish refusnik or any of the dissidents of people who were talking to us. You didn't call them from your home phone. But they'd called me at home. And so I asked one of them, I said, so what's going on? Do you think they stopped bugging our phones? And the answer was, no, of course not. They're still bugging them. It doesn't matter anymore. There are not going to be consequences. So for me, that was a defining moment. Another defining moment that year, August 1987, Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact anniversary is in August, and some of the people released in early 87 were Lithuanian dissidents some of them had spent a long time in prison. And they announced that they were going to hold a public demonstration in Vilnius. And some of us heard about it. We actually heard about it from the Soviet press, of all things. And a few correspondents flew to Vilnius. And sure enough, here come the dissidents. They're all dressed in black, and they're singing those gorgeous Lithuanian songs. And the amazing thing was that they get to this square, and there are like dozens of other people there. By other people, I mean, students, academics, workers, ordinary people. It still took something to be willing to go to that, but it was not the hardcore dissidents. Like from your era, something like this would happen and it'd be over in a minute, right?
Sure.
You unfurl the banner, there'd be 5 people
45
there.
seconds.
Yeah, and they're gone. This went on for hours. And I went around, I'm interviewing people, at this event, and asking them, so why are you here? How did you hear about it? And some of them said, well, from the Golasi, from VOA, from RFERL. Some of them said from Soviet media. And I said, okay, but I read those stories in the Soviet media, and they went something like this. Some horrible dissident people are planning to have a demonstration in Vilnius this weekend, and anybody who would turn up at that as a parasite or a hooligan, or, pick your term. And I said, so how could you read that and think that it was okay to come to this event? And they said, well, we weren't sure, but they've never written about it before, and the fact that they're writing about it means something has changed. And that's a moment when I realized, like, if you lived there, you understood stuff a whole lot better than any of us ever really, really could. Nuances were, understood and acted on as they were that day. Some people did have consequences after that demonstration. They were pretty minor compared to the 45-second roll everybody up and take them down to the police station. But the whole thing went on. It was still going on when I left. That's how long it went on. And yet there were obvious KGB guys all over the place, but they didn't act. They didn't arrest anybody. So, here we are, 1987, and what we've learned is that it's okay, to talk on the phone now and say stuff that in the past, you would never want them to hear. It's okay to actually hold a public protest. Imagine that. This is, as far as I know, like the first one that went without interference in decades, maybe forever in the Soviet Union. After that, like these defining moments began to pile up, and I experienced more and more of these things, started collecting them, and at some point realized the story I most want to do while I'm here is about the disappearance of fear. Because for me, so much was happening, so much was changing. We're covering, politics, economy, many different stories, but for me, that was the story of my era in Moscow. I was living in this huge country where, that had been repressed for decades, and now collectively people were being freed and were able to say what they thought, and to say it very freely, and they wanted to talk. I mean, it got to the point where sometimes I would think, I wish the Millie Man would stop people from coming in. I could relax a little bit more. It took a long time to put together that disappearance of fear story as a radio piece, but I did finally, and began with some of those defining moments, that demonstration in Vilnius, and a lot of things that followed. I happened to be in Riga one day when like hundreds of people start walking through town, and they've got green headbands on, like, the Greens in Western Europe, and they're protesting a subway project in Riga. I went to Siberia when the miners were on strike. Orthodox believers could worship much more freely than ever before. Environmentalists became active. Political reformers, all of us are covering all these stories all over the country, all the time on all kinds of issues. But fundamentally, why were they happening? In large part because people were losing their fear and speaking out like never before. So for correspondents, this was a great time. We were frantic covering all this stuff. But it was also important to be able to put it in context for people, because over in the US, people were saying, Gorbachev's a great hero. Well, at home, not so much. Certainly, and that became more and more true as time went on. Because think back to, why Glasnost began. Gorbachev could see the economic disaster his country was headed for, but in order to bring about reform, he had to start telling people the truth, but not all the truth, just, some bits of truth, so that they would understand that all those reports about, comrades, we overfulfilled the plan again this year. Well, maybe that hadn't actually happened. And that's why we need agricultural reforms. That's why we need other reforms in the economy. And for a long time, or for some time anyway, Gorbachev thought that he could stay in control of this process, that he and the party could control what people could know and what they couldn't know. And man, was he wrong. Because after it began, Glasnost began to take on a life of its own, amazingly often led by Soviet journalists who grew up in this system, but were out there pushing the envelope, but also by lots of other people, in all walks of life. Scott Shane, who was there at the time for the Baltimore Sun, wrote a terrific book called Dismantling Utopia. I was looking at it this week and was reminded of so many stories that I covered and I've forgotten. By mid-1988, he wrote, so much had been published that contradicted what was in school textbooks that school history exams for the year just had to be canceled. What was Soviet history anymore? And that one example, I think, really captures how chaotic this information flood had become. we're all reveling in it. It's wonderful. You know, we love information. We love being able to talk to people who will tell us exactly what they're thinking. And it was exhausting, it was exhilarating, and it was also really challenging, because the kinds of things we're getting from our editors are, where are things headed? What's Gorbachev up to? Will there be a coup, and when? And, you know, people's vacation plans would be canceled because, oh no, you can't leave. We hear all these rumors that there could be a coup. I'm going to read you a couple of observations from Scott Shane's book that was written obviously afterwards, but I think really captures you know, some of what was going on that we were living through at that time and kind of struggling to convey. Scott says, what happened was very different from what Gorbachev wanted to happen. He set out to renew socialism, not to destroy it, to make the empire stronger, not to break it apart. Sometimes Gorbachev looked flexible and courageous, like a democratic reformer. Other times he fell back on the stubbornness and the cruelty of Communist Party traditions. You know, this was really a titanic struggle, and if you didn't understand that, and if you weren't trying to explain it the best you could to your audience, then they had no context for the last year that I was there, 1991. That's the year of the Soviet invasion of Lithuania, which had been the first republic to declare independence. It was also the year of the attempted coup in August. And those are moments when this titanic struggle became very, very public, very dramatic, and kind of got resolved, more or less, at least for a time. And so I'm going to end with just one anecdote from the very end of my time there. It's like days or a couple of weeks maybe after the August coup had failed. The Supreme Soviet was meeting, and it may have been for their very last time. And all the reformers there, of course, are giddy. You know, victory had been theirs. Maybe we're actually looking forward to that bright future that Soviet communism had always promised and never delivered. And I met one of the Supreme Soviet members who I'd been in touch with ever since he first ran for that quasi-democratic Congress of People's Deputies, Alexei Yemelyanov, wonderful guy. And we're talking about all this, and he's smiling and very happy. And then he says something to me about, you know, the world should pay us a tax. And I'm like, what did I miss here? What are you talking about? And he said, look, you know, this idea was put out there of communism. And this country, 70 years ago, decided to pick it up and run with it as an experiment. And it didn't work. And nobody else in the world now has to go through that and waste their time and energy and resources and all of that. And they should pay us a tax for our trouble. And he smiled when he said that. You know, it was a joke, but, you know, it was so, to me, when I think back on it, it was so symbolic of that moment. There was a buoyancy and optimism, and you could joke and look forward to a future of freedom and satisfaction and hope. And that's the way it was when I left in late September 1991.
And where is he today?
You know, I don't know. I looked him up, and there's nothing current on the internet about him, so I'm not sure.
Anyone who will experience the flood of information that Anne's talking about, which I did on 2 or 3 visits in 87 and 88, and the sudden ability of people to talk and eagerness to talk, led by the extraordinary Alexander Yakovlev, the most important figure in Gorbachev's circle. It makes the current events so much sadder, really. It's just incredible.